Fabien Lévy has been an actor member since really the beginning of this project. He studied composition with Gerard Grisey at the Conservatoire in Paris and was resident at the Villa Medici, French Academy in Rome, and in Berlin with the DAAD Artist Program. His works have been published by Bilodeau, by Ricordi Germany, and since 2018 by Editions Peters, and he's been performed by a real kind of honor roll of major contemporary ensembles and orchestras, including Ensemble Recherche, Ensemble Moderne, the Argento Ensemble, the Deutsche Symphony Orchestra, and many more. He has taught at the Hochschule für Musik Hans Eisler, as a professor of composition at Columbia University, at Hochschule für Musik Detmold, and since 2017 has been a senior professor for composition at the Hochschule für Musik und Theater Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy in Leipzig. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce and to turn things over to Fabien Lévy.
Many thanks, Bob. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you all to be there. I am very impressed how many people are here. I will share my screen. And let me know if normally it works. I lost now my Zoom. Okay, so I will start with this functional orchestration. Some of you know very well about what it is. Some of you don't know at all. So I will try to do a mix in 50 minutes about the principles and the last research. Some of you are even part of the research, and I will speak about that. So as Bob said, I am mostly a composer, and it's a little bit by chance that I started to teach orchestration, because keyboards at CNSMDP, there was no orchestration class in Germany when I arrived, separated from composition, and keyboards asked me to be adjunct in orchestration, which I didn't think about. And then while teaching composition at the different places, I started to teach orchestration as well, separately, because I thought it was important. And then came actor, and actor was a fantastic way to develop this field, which is called functional orchestration. What does it mean? When I studied in Paris, I studied with different teachers, and they were all very intuitive, saying here is something missing. The good orchestration professor feels the music. Orchestration is not yet really part of music theory, which is sad, and it was very intuitive. And my last orchestration professor, Marc-André Dalbavie at the National Paris Conservatory, started really to use some principles like directionality, and directionality, we see that, which are really efficient and which allowed us to understand better the score and to better compose also. I will speak about that. And then when I started to teach, automatically I started to think about those categories, and those categories developed. I had some exchanges with other people, while I have to say that all my colleagues from Paris Conservatory teaching orchestration sometimes were not interested with this research, and it was in actor that really things evolved, because we have the mix of people being good in orchestration and having the will to verbalize this concept, which is mostly not the case. People like to orchestrate, and they are not formalizing, and the other one. So it's really new, I think, in music theory, and this is what I will discuss today. So first, very simple question that we all have: what is orchestration? But you will see why I ask that. In the common sense, for many people, this is about its techniques and functions. I will define that for constructing and transforming the timbre that apply to musical elements intended to be perceived as one entity. So all what we do, playing techniques, how to write a chord, techniques of doubling, texture, etc. This is what we think to be the orchestration in the common sense. For those who are participants to actors, we know that it's a little bit more complex, and thanks to all the participants of actors, thanks to Steve McAdams, thanks to the psychoacoustics, we know that an important part of orchestration is, of course, also how to deal with elements which are perceived as segregated, as separated, whether they are simultaneously segregated, for example, melody accompaniment, background, foreground, or they are separated in time, how to make a contrast, how to make the imitation later of the same sound, but in another tonality, how to make a progression, etc. So, and that is really in the center of the actor paradigm, I think. This is what Steve, Bob, Boolean, etc. Brought precisely, and you will see it influences a lot, of course, our research. And since 2019, I was obliged to add a third category, which is still in development. It's still not clear for me in terms of verbalization, and I call that sound mastering. In a way, this is there are the techniques and functions that aim to create effects comparable to those created by a sound engineer in the recording and audio post-production studio. It means on the whole results, and I call that sound mastering functions. If I insist on those three different ways, families of functions, this is because this is the way I will speak today. I will first present all the functions applied to musical elements intended to be perceived as one entity, then all the functions, or some functions, I will be very quick, applied to elements intended to include a perceptual separation of entities, and then the sound mastering function. So what is functional orchestration? Very quickly, some of you know very well, some others don't know. The idea is to verbalize, to isolate and verbalize universal principles of the composition and differentiation of timbres, separated from the techniques, and to rely the effects, which are universal, what we perceive, and the techniques which are related to a certain period of time, which are a certain style of the composer, which a certain instrumentation, of course. And we use techniques, but the idea is to ask us what is the function for. Victor Cordero, who was there, had a very good idea. In a way, functions is the aim. What does the compositor want? But the aim expressed in a quite musical way. So, and like that, you have a relationship between the effect and what do we want as a composer. And then we apply which techniques will work for that or that instrumentation piece, etc., to apply these functions. So, an example that I give all the time, most of you know that, but it's very good. When we speak about crescendo, you see many young composers who write a crescendo on their instrument to make a crescendo. No, a crescendo, to make a crescendo, you can, of course, ask the instruments to make a crescendo, but you have many other techniques like adding a lot of instruments, changing of register, etc. So you have, on one hand, the function crescendo, the aim, I want a crescendo, which is actually an effect, which is I want to increase the amplitude. And you have the different techniques which don't correspond automatically to the crescendo. An example that I have here, for example, this is a Haydn symphony, and it doesn't write change of dynamics, but just with the trumpets, natural trumpets, and horns going to the high register, he implies a crescendo. So we have a lot of techniques for the function crescendo. Another example that we will see, we all know what are doublings, but what for? And here, after many research, I could isolate 6 different functions for the doublings with a lot of techniques, of course. So the research started really in 2003 when I started to teach, but it was the beginning, and it was the chance that I had is one day music theoreticians, GMTA, the German music theory group, invited me to speak about that, so I was obliged to verbalize it for the first time. I wrote my first article in German, and since 2017, with exchanges in Actor, it developed a lot, and I want to thank Denise Boulian, Victor Cordero, Bob Kawa, Steve McAdams, Kit Soden, Lasse Torensen, as well as 2 of my former students, Ezan Moha Gegifa, 3, Sebastian Henzel, and Pek Sungte, who helped me a lot with some concepts. So now we start, and I advise you also to grab your headphones because we will have a lot of sounds examples. Okay, so we start with, so we will have this plan today with functions that apply to musical elements intended to be perceived as one entity, then segregated, and then the sound mastering functions. We start with the first one. I will speak quickly about different functions that apply to musical elements intended to be perceived as one element. So first, very quickly, the parameters which are impacted when we do that are not only the timbre, but timbre, dynamics, and space. For the timbre, I will speak about a few things, but we know this is register and playing techniques, timbre analogy, and meta timbre, how to write a chord, etc. So until the texture, I will speak about that. Dynamics and space, I will just mention one thing which is important because it opened a lot my vision of orchestration, and still in psychoacoustics it's not studied a lot, but Dalbavie spoke a lot. This is the idea of space. You have three different things when you speak about space. Of course, functional orchestration works for instruments, but also for electroacoustic. You have the location of the sound that we know a lot in electroacoustic. It's more difficult in an orchestra or in an ensemble, but it's possible. We have the directionality and the projection of the sounds, and we have the space focus. It means it can be projected in one direction, but opens in a few directions. We will see that. So something which was really striking by Dalbavie, he was making a difference between directionality and indirectionality on the instruments, which makes a difference between other differences that we have between loud, not loud, etc. An example that we have is oboe is directional. It's not as loud as the horn, but it's directional, and the horn is not directional. And the trumpet, when they don't have mute, are mostly by the classics directional. Trombone too. So flute is indirectional, we will see that. So if you see, that is a student of mine who did this graph, but you have that in Meyer, in the book by Meyer or other things. You see that very clearly. The flute is really indirectional, mostly even more in the high register. The oboe is really directional. The clarinet is middle directional. Of course, you can like Mahler ask the clarinet or the horn to play high. That is a modern music, and the bassoon is mostly middle directional. And composers from the beginning knew that and knew that in a certain way. So further concepts, I won't speak about that. I will be very quick. We have only 50 minutes. But there are all the domain of the analogies. You know that many composers try to imitate instruments. Beethoven tries in the Eroica to imitate the snare drum, and he doesn't use the snare drum. He uses the strings, he uses the contrabass at the beginning, etc. Ravel creates. So this is a task by many composers, this sort of imitation, Mussorgsky or Tristan Murat imitating the bell, etc. And here, in psychoacoustic, of course, the idea of analogies evolved a lot, as well as a concept developed by Kisoden with here, the idea of metatimbre, which is a general concept which is very, very efficient. And also you have the notion of paratimbre. So I ask you to read the PhD of Kit. Then you have all the techniques of vertical aggregates. I won't insist on that. That is pretty known. This is what you find in many instrumentation books, which I must say are not orchestration books. I mean, they are mostly speaking about the instruments, Instrumentenkunde in German, and you have very, very few literature on orchestration itself. But that is mentioned, the different way to write a chord, and then you have a lot of different subtleties, like here Sibelius putting the oboes in the extreme, etc. I won't insist on that. Sorry. Then you have, of course, the chapter of the doubling techniques. We know that, but after a while, I think I started to characterize the different doublings. And now I am in a point where I can say there are 6 main functions for the doubling techniques, whatever they are. Of course, when you apply a real technique with 2 instruments, they will have different consequences. They won't have only one function, you will see, because 2 instruments can be always louder or etc. But you have 6 main functions which are helpful for the composers, for the analysts also to understand how it works. The first one, so I developed 2012, 2015 to develop these 6 functions. The first one, this is what I call the dynamic reinforcement. It means you increase the amplitude, for example, 2 horns. Once again, 2 horns can create also chorus effect, etc. But you increase the amplitude. The second one, difficult to understand, but it exists a lot. This is the spatial projection reinforcement. You change the spatial projection. For example, you have a cantus firmus in the low register in the 2T with all your trombones. It's clear because it's directional, but if you want to do even more clearer, you open the space in doubling with horns, and like that you have directional and unidirectional sounds, and you change the projection. I give you another example. You have, by the classics too, sometimes the violins, all the strings playing, and Mozart or Rossini add a flute in the middle register, second octave, so it's not very efficient. You don't hear the flute, but actually it opens the space. Here I have an example from Rossini. I know that it's very, very still, so put your loudspeaker a little bit more. I won't speak. And look at this flute, which arrives here. Of course, you have the harmony also. I would speak about that later, but it changes the sound of the strings. I don't speak. Okay. So you see here, it's very clear. The flute adds a space, a little bit with the timbre, but almost nothing. It's really to open the space. Then you have all the doublings that I call spectral densification. We know that, for example, typically, cello with the double bass, you open the spectrum, or violins in octaves, which sounds the timbre of the violins, but with a more open spectrum. So you change a little bit the spectrum. You have the contrary. Imagine a lot of cello and double bass playing short notes. You want to precise the sounds. So this is what I call a doubling for tone or centroid reinforcement. For example, you add a bassoon, and like that, you have something very precise. Then you have the fifth category, which is known. It's change of timbre. But I differentiate two different things, or Dalbavie already did that. When you can recognize from where the sounds are coming, for example, flute and xylophone by Bartok, but you still recognize the flute and the xylophone. And the sixth category, this is what Dalbavie calls mixture. It's a term which comes from the organ. And from mixing different instruments, you create a new one, and you can't recognize from where it is. There is an emergence, a new timbre emerges. I will give some examples later. It's an entire chapter in orchestration, how to create interesting mixture. So we have the 6 aims. Now, mixture, I won't speak about mixture. Yeah, there are a lot of very interesting mixtures. The first one, which is really the syntagmatic mixture in the history, this is Schubert's Unfinished Symphony with the clarinet and the bow, which sounds almost like a soprano saxophone. You don't recognize that, and he does that consciously because, for example, if you look at the score, he starts the accompaniment with the first and second violin. So he mentioned from the beginning, it starts the accompaniment. Normally, it's second violin and viola doing the accompaniment. By the classics, he makes the first violin to surprise the people having these sounds which comes from somewhere else, which we don't know. So it's here. I won't speak about that. Debussy, a lot of mixture, La Mer's foghorn. This one is known, I will say. So we could, you have the dies irae, you have the ophicleide, and you have a bassoon. Normally, if it was a centroid doubling, the bassoon would be one bassoon double with the ophicleide, with the tuba. Here, it's not at all what it does. I play that, it's loud, be careful. Okay, so you have 4 bassoons and 1 octave lower than the ophicleide. So of course here, he wants to create a particular sound. He makes a mixture to imitate an organ. It's a very known mixture. It's a very interesting mixture. You want to imitate an organ for the DSI. It's beautiful here. Okay, Ligeti. So I won't play many. Something which is not so known. You can even do mixture with one instrument alone. And here it's in Saint-Saëns, fifth concerto for piano. You will see he has a melody with the piano, and typically like a mixture, here he makes the fundamental and the third and fifth harmonics in another dynamic. So it's really a spectral writing, mezzo piano and pianissimo. It sounds like a xylophone. And later with the contrast, you have everybody more classical, mezzo forte in octaves, and the contrast is really interesting. So listen to that. Okay, so you have here is an example. I see Pablo. It comes from him. Lachenmann, Serenade, where you have also this sort of spectral orchestration with different dynamics. So here I imitate the Gagaku sound. So now we have another type of coupling. This is a discussion that I had with Keith, and which is in the literature, between coupling and doubling. There are many discussions whether coupling and doubling are the same term, and doubling must be limited to pitch or pitch class couplings. For most of theoreticians of orchestration, a coupling is a physical action joining instruments and register. And Sam Adler and Rimsky-Korsakov both seem to slightly differentiate coupling and doubling, even if the difference is only implied, and the examples of coupling are all synchronic doubling. Coupling is seen for them more as an action of intention in analogy to the couplers of an organ that couple simultaneously different registers, while doubling is seen more as a fact on the score. Therefore, they both reduce the coupling to two instruments playing to the same passage at parallel intervals. I had a problem with this definition because you have a lot of examples in the music. So you remember that. We heard that already. This is the DSRI with the doubling. But later, Berlioz does that. So which means that you have something perceived as one element, but which is coupled non-synchronically. Ta pa pa, ta pa ta, ta ta ta, ta ta ta. So I needed a concept, and for me, this is that the coupling in terms of mechanics. You have even an organ in Germany where you push a button and another sound comes a little bit later, but it's perceived as one because you have the regular time shifting, which helps cognitively to perceive that as one. And you have a lot of examples in the music. And from that discussion, I developed other categories of temporal coupling. So my definition is that temporal coupling to any orchestration function where two or more instruments are written so that they are perceived as one merged entity along the timelines, but the coupling doesn't automatically imply strict synchronicity of the note or strictly parallel intervals. And we see here, we are once again in the typical actor paradigm where we differentiate that it's perceived as one element, even if you have different elements, and what is on the score. And then later, I will explain quickly, I have a lot of different doubling, synchronical doubling that we know, temporal coupling by regular time shifting, by heterophony, by distorted gesture, by augmentation, and by texturization. I will come to that. So for example, here, very known, Unfinished Symphony that I quote a lot. Sorry, I don't have the extract. You have the accompaniment of the cello, and you have just after pu, 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 ta, pa, pa, ta, with the horns doing an echo. They are completely coupled. They are perceived as one line, as an echo. It's temporal coupling with regular shifting. Another example that you have here in Schumann between the brass and the winds, which come just later, and it's okay. Okay, so, and now we can do the difference between a pitch doubling, a regular time shifting, and you have a third category, which is the heterophony, means when you have the lines which are not synchronized, but also not regularly shifted, but perceived as one element. I have few examples in the classical music, for example, here, where Berlioz has a line here with the strings and a sort of echo with the winds, which are not with the same rhythm. Okay, but of course, in many other cultures, like in the Gagaku, you have this love for the heterophony, so that the sound is really alive. So here you have the shakuhachi, the hichiriki, and the ueki, who don't play exactly together with the sho making the harmony, and that makes the richness of these sounds. Then a typical temporal coupling by distributed gesture and augmentation. Here an example from Color by Dalbavie, where you see you have one gesture on the piano, for example, and all the instruments do a part of that, and you hear one element distributed along a different instrument. This is what I call temporal coupling by distributed gesture and augmentation. You have that also by Stravinsky. Here you have two layers, but this one is distributed, and here also you have what is called in French a monnayage. So you have here the second violin, and you have that. So you distribute your gesture. Then you have what I call augmentation, even l'oiseau de feu here, where you augment your gesture and you distribute your gesture in different. It's very important in orchestration, of course. Then I go to virtual instruments, which is a category that I use actually at the beginning for me, as a composer, much before teaching orchestration, to characterize in my own music elements heard as sound and identities that does not correspond to a single instrument, either because they switch from one real instrument to another, or because they are constituted of several coupled instruments heard as one element, and more important here, read as one element. There is something important. The term generalizes the different techniques of doubling, coupling, distribution, augmentation, exchange, and texturing in order to highlight one very important technical goal of the orchestration, to perceptually forget the actual instruments and their timbre references, and to create instead previously unheard virtual instruments. So this is something, when I started to compose seriously, that I use all the time in music, and much later, so I was calling that virtual instrument to help me. For example, here, 98, one of my early pieces, I have instruments which travel from one voice to another and create what I call at that time called virtual instruments. We'll listen to that. And see, this is something very important in my music, because exchanging the voices between instruments help actually to have this sort of cognitive misleading, and it helps to merge. We will see later the technique of merging. It's one category which is also important with others. And for example, here another piece, much more recent, I do all the time that in my music. So you have this cognitive misleading with the exchange. It's an accordion and piano, but you create a new instrument. Here it's a classical example that I showed at the beginning of Actor, you remember, this is Brahms, the Fourth Symphony, and you have to read here as one virtual instrument. You have the contrabass, from the contrabass, the cello coming, and the viola coming. It's very important. Here it's clear because I put colors, but when you don't have the colors, many young conductors, for example, read the viola in one line. And of course, if you read like that, you don't understand the music. You have to understand first the virtual instrument and then the function that they have. Here it's the accompaniment, here's the melody. With the contrast, you have one virtual instrument called violin in octave, so doubling with spectral densification. Then you have a contrast here with what I call the trilogic. We'll see that later. One viola only, but if you read the second violin in one line, you are lost. So you have to see all those virtual instruments to understand the music, or to create a lot of virtual instruments when you compose, so that you don't have one instrument doing one role. So, and then we come to different merging strategy, which is a big chapter, but I won't speak about that, just so that you know that it's part, of course, of the orchestration. I differentiate 4 types of merging techniques: the acoustical merging techniques. So, for example, common timbre or range, but it's not enough. You see a lot of young composers writing the same range, and I think it would create a texture of virtual instrument. It doesn't work. And directional instruments, quiet dynamic, noisy sounds, of course, which help to mix better. We'll see that later for the texture. You have, after that, all the strategies of merging with the pitch, for example, common notes, parallelism, doubling and coupling, speech class merging, such as harmonicity, tonality, spectrality, etc. You have all the strategy of rhythm, which I use a lot in my music, temporal coupling techniques such as synchronicity or regular shifting between the different elements, heterophony and other coupling, but more when you have a common pulse. Of course, suddenly things work together. We'll see some example in some texture. And you have what I told you, the cognitive merging strategies. So, and with the techniques, it's less discussed, but it's very important in my music. For example, exchange between different instruments of the same motif, or imitation of shapes, etc. Paratimbric analogies, which help. I have only one virtual instrument. So the special case of texture, I will insist a little bit of that. I presented that during the last Actor yearly things. It's very new, but it developed. I work on that since 5-6 years, but thanks Sung Tae Peck, the students, and also speaking with physicians, I will explain why, I could now, I think, reach a good point. So what is the problem of texture? It's a new term in musicology. It appeared in the 50s. And in many theoretic books, even today, texture refers to the many ways in which notes, rhythms, or voice layers interact. Texture is often opposed to structure, where structure will represent the skeleton of the music and texture the way the music is arranged. Problem, it's generally everything, and it's generally divided into 4 categories: monophony, homophony, polyphony, heterophony. They are all texture. I put some bibliographical references here in English, even in the groove, here in German, where everything which is interlaced is a texture in musicology. Of course, for us, in the actor paradigm, it doesn't work, even in orchestration, sorry, because Walter Piston, for example, in his orchestration treatise, has 7 types of what he calls texture: the orchestra unison, melody and accompaniment is a texture for him, secondary melody, part writing, contrapuntal texture, chords, complex texture. So, of course, in the actor paradigm, it doesn't work because we don't differentiate what is perceived as one element and what is perceived as different elements. Here, I took a photograph of the carpet in the train, as the ICE, and you see here, certainly, we won't say that this is one texture. We will see this one is a texture and this one is a texture, but we segregate the 2 textures. So what is a texture? It's the most important thing. It's perceived as one element. If you take the etymology of the texture, text, context, texture, it comes from tissue. So it's all what is interlaced, but perceived as one. Of course, you have the difficulties with, you can have heterogeneous texture with metal and wood, but it's important that it's perceived as one element. So for me, it was an enigma. And Denis Boulian, Steve McAdams, and Keith Soden already come quite along this idea. And here I have two definitions. And so now I define the texture as a particular coupling where a combination of two or more moving elements is perceived as one merging element, and this for a sustained time, either static or in a continuous transition. There is neither perception of concurrent segregation between elements nor sequential contrast or temporal rapid change in the object's perception, but a perception of one unity both in the moment and over time, concomitant with a perception of either stasis and internal movement within the unity. And I thank also Bob and Steve for the discussion we had last summer. So here I can differentiate the gesture, where you have a perception of temporal contrast and rapid change, the contrapoint, where you have perception of concurrent segregation between voices, and then the two texture, the temporal block, it means it's a motionless texture, and a texture with motion. So automatically, the concept of motion is very important to understand what is a texture. And then technically, for a texture, we need three types of strategies to be realized. We need all the merging strategies, techniques, so that we perceive that as one element, unlike of the polyphony. We need the stretching techniques, so that the element is perceived as one long time, as one element without contrast or complex shape, unlike the gesture. But we need also, for the compared to the block, something to create the motion, the agitation, the micro-segregation. I don't know which one to take as a concept, but techniques, so that the element is perceived with micro-agitations and not as monochrome surface. And I started to categorize that. It was really difficult. So I went to what is called the mesoscopic physics. This is people who work on foam and grains, and to see if I could apply that to the music. And it works very well. You can differentiate a texture through the density. It's dense or not dense. Through the regularity, what I call the entropy. It means here it's a texture which is regular. Here it's pretty chaotic. Through the homogeneity or heterogeneity, through the sharpness, through the sound mastering. After that, you have to study the degree of change globally, and you have something where you have to characterize the micro level, the fiber organization versus the envelope, and you can have a lot of things. And I started to characterize a few textures. I start with the, something important. Like that, in terms of music theory, you have a fantastic concept, because you can even speak about texturization. It means you have an object and you put it in motion, but it's perceived as one element. So it becomes a texturization. And for example, it applies very well to understand the music of Debussy, where he has different elements. It's here, it's not one texture, it's a polyphonical, but he puts in motion the different elements. It's really a characteristic of Debussy. I showed that. So, you have really one characteristic of the Debussy music after Jeu, a little bit in la mer, etc. Also here, Claria Notar, many young composers who want the grain, the punctum, to texturize the sounds. So we start, I will be very quick, I won't say in detail, but we can then characterize the homogeneous texture first through their motion strategies. So for example, all where the motion strategies are wave-like movements. Ravel, Daphne St. Chloe. With the wave-like movement. And then you see for every texture, you speak about, you analyze the motion strategy, then you analyze the merging strategy. Why is it perceived as one texture, so the acoustical techniques, or the pitch techniques, or the rhythmical techniques, or the cognitive techniques when they exist, and then you characterize the texture you speak about the densities, entropy, the homogeneity of timbre, sharpness, sound mastering, time change, etc. It's just a few examples. Someone has to do a PhD on that, of course. Here, another one using also the wave-like motion strategy. But you have different types of putting an homogeneous texture in motion. I give you another one, micropolyphony. It's another technique of motion. So I will go, and then you characterize everything. Or you can put with shifted similar small gesture. And you have common pitches, etc. After that, you analyze all the things, same spectrum, common notes, no rhythm, etc. You analyze a little bit how the texture is made. And then you come to the heterogeneous texture. Of course, heterogeneous texture has one difficulty more, is why is it a texture and not different layers? Why is it not segregated? So here you try to speak about what makes it as a texture. So for example, most easy thing, clear perceived common pulse as merging strategy. For example, here Berlioz, it's loud. Of course, when I say merging strategy, it's not only the common pulse. You need always 2 or 3 strategies to be merged. So you have common pitches, harmony, etc. And you analyze that precisely. So here, all the merging strategy, even cognitive merging strategies, exchange of pitches between voices, etc. I won't have time to analyze those things. Here, it's a student of mine who did that. You see, she has percussions and piano. Normally, it doesn't merge, but because of the common pulse and the exchange of pitches and many things, suddenly you had the notion of that it's one virtual instrument. More difficult heterogeneous texture with non-homorhythmic motifs. For example, here, Strauss. And you analyze why. I go quickly. Stravinsky. Here, it's even more difficult. So, because you don't have really the... So, I will... Here it works because you have common pitches, but also because you have some cognitive strategies like repetition of elements, and you perceive that as one texture, although it's really heterogeneous. So Uzuchin, even here, you don't have common pitches, but you have gestures which repeat and they are transposed. It's with spectrum. And it works like a texture. So here it's an example of my music because I want to speak about the micro-organization. It goes down, but you don't perceive down, and the transition is in a certain direction. With a spectral merging, etc. So, and of course, the noisy heterogeneous texture, when you make the sound more noisy, it helps to merge. And for example, a good example is Bert Führer still. It merges. Not only the noise, but the pitch. It shows the directionality of the instruments. They are all unidirectional, and you have strategies of pitch. Okay. So that is, we are already 50, but I will continue with the second chapter and the third. I will try to be quick, but it just... Now, all the functions that apply to musical elements intended to include a perceptual segregation of entities. So, of course, you have to speak about the discrimination strategies, and I'm sure the psychoacousticians speak a lot. Let's say you need at least to make sure that that is me as a composer and a composition professor, to segregate different layers, 2 groups of elements. You need different strategies. You need an heterogeneity of timbre, but it's not sufficient. You see many young composers who put a violin with oboe and they think it would be enough to have different layers. Of course, the directionality in every layer, you see by Schoenberg and people of this time, Schrecker, etc. There are different layers, so very contrapuntal music. In each layer, you have directional and indirectional instruments to be sure that they are perceived as voice. You have a contrasted writing between layers, like separation of range, or the different harmonies, polytonality by Stravinsky, or a race before the entry of highlights to highlight the beginning of new motifs, contrary motion help, different rhythm and minimal or metrical pulse, etc. So I don't have time to speak about that. It's like a composition lesson. But here you see, for example, it's very classical. Debussy, you have a different range, but not so much. But you have this syncopation. You have a group orchestration, means one in one group, one layer in one group, one layer in the strings. But you have also those syncopations, which are very classical and which help to differentiate one layer from the other one. Here by Schoenberg, this is what I said. You have a lot of directional instruments, and you have also different rhythm, so that the different voices don't merge. Here, Webern, it's even more interesting because you have also the texturization of the sound or the playing technique, which help also with other things to segregate things. I have a principle that my students know, which I call the principle of trilogic, which applies very well in the classical music. Also later, where it's about clarity of contrast. You need to orchestrate, of course, your contrast, but you need to hierarchize the different contrasts. When you have third theme, thematic group, and second thematic group, you see in most of the good composers of the classic music that they have, for example, the unfinished, first theme with melody, the winds, strings for the accompaniment, and second theme, mostly the strings in the winds in the accompaniment, so viola and clarinet, and the melody with the strings. So you have a clear differentiation, which helps then to differentiate much more subtle, what I call the phraseological, all what is different motifs, but also in a motif question answer. I don't go here, but sometimes it's more weight. Generally, it's more weight in the second part of the sentence and then accent the time. You can go very deep in the differentiation in orchestration. And this is what we do in orchestration. When we orchestrate, we try to see every accent and to analyze through this trilogic that. Another principle which is important, this is a principle of equal balance between layers. When you have a crescendo, for example, and you have different layers, you have to apply so that's a technique so that the relationship between the layers stays. For example, you make a crescendo in all layers. I have here the classical example by Schubert, where you have one layer, which is this exchange, and the harmony. Second times, step 2 of the crescendo increases here with double bass. Here he puts one octave layer higher, but then you have the harmony, which is much more dense with the directional instruments, and you have brass. And in the third steps, I don't want to analyze here, it's pretty complex, but he increases everything with directional instrument. You have one register for the accompaniment with the syncopation, so that it doesn't merge. You have the syncopation with directional instruments. So here, oboe. When here it's low, that is high. And when this one is high, that is low with the trombones. And it keeps something for the harmony, etc. So it's here you have a lot of virtual instruments if you want. Very, very. Same thing, for example, here I can play. Step 2. Step 3. And you have a strict differentiation of the layers and this principle. Same thing here, for example, Alborada del Gracioso, you see it's pretty complex, but the virtual instrument of the harmony continues, but the layers are amplified. You have all the difficulties of connecting the independent layers through when you have some change, not only change of dynamics, but you change the space of one layer. How do you do with the other layer? That is an important problematic. The character, even in Ravel, one layer changes. How do you do? So I don't want to speak here, but it's very interesting musically. Then you have what I call rhizomatic logic, because you have some composers who don't apply this logic. Beethoven, typically, because he wants things to be more complex And sometimes you will have, because as you know, by Beethoven, a small element, we don't perceive that, will become important, and the orchestration follows that. For example, having the direction instrument for the accompaniment, etc. I won't speak about that today. You have the same thing by Wagner, of course, with the lines, the Parade of Tristan, where something is born from something else, and it's completely rhizomatic from Deleuze and from the biology. And even a Schumann is pretty rhizomatic, but I think it's unconsciously, and it's sometimes very complex. And for example, here I have an example coming from Ezan, a student of mine, where you have the orchestration by Schumann, and you see it's pretty complex. You don't know what is the role of the oboe, and here it's really dirty. And then Mahler made it more properly, and really in terms of trilogic, we can listen to the both orchestration, you will understand what I mean. I don't know if it's intentional or not, and if Mahler is right to correct, but so that's Schumann. And that's Mahler. Things are much more clean, let's say, with Mahler. So, and we go, and there are other functions. We go to the sound mastering function because we don't have so much time. Here it's what is very new for me. So let's say it's still in development, but it's all the question of presence and focus functions, all the notion of humidifications function, sustaining, etc. The change of room, I will show you some examples, room simulation, all the question of background, noise, and this category, which is, I don't know how to call that, it's all when you add on-off, one-off special effects. I call that now musical emotive signs, like emoticon, because the music exists, but you add something to make understand the music. So I call that emotive signs. I will give examples. And then the complete images, for example, the ensemble treatments mastering. I don't have time to speak about that. Something about the humidification, very known here. Haydn, it's interesting because he's in the Neapolitan, it's an introduction. He has a theme and he puts, I'll let you listen and so it's typical here, a horn function, but we are in the Neapolitan, he can't use the horn, so he uses the bassoon, but he thinks in terms of this 5-1 for the horn. You say that all the time when you have the second half of the sentence and you want to do that more wet. We had the example by Rossini, I don't know if you remember, with the flute, and here once again he puts some wet sounds with a harmony on the horns and later, because it's the answer of the sentence. A principle that I apply in my own music, very old piece, once again, my first saxophone quartet. I have a texture which is pretty dry, and I want to put more merging, and I put a bass. It's a very classical, even you'll find that already by Brahms, putting the bass at the end of the sentence. You see the bass helps to make it more wet and to merge everything. All what goes with the projection, space, and room acoustic simulation, the classical thing is what we call an echo. We have the big tutti, for example, here, Schubert, big tutti accent, and he orchestrates the echo of the room, first with the harmony which is in the back, with the wind instrument in the back, and at the end of the echo, he removes the directional and the nasal instruments to continue with the harmony, the echo. So that is very classic. Here, something interesting, he makes the same thing, but written in a very interesting way, Berlioz. What is interesting is when you take the Leibowitz orchestration treatise, he didn't understand that and he thinks it's not. No, it's an orchestration effect. it's to orchestrate the background. But in a very interesting way. It's not the classical issue. Here, I don't speak about that, but it's very, very interesting in Bartok, where you orchestrate a site, it's the door of the tears, but he orchestrates the whole of the room. We can listen to that. He orchestrates the whole of the room because you see it's all unidirectional, everything is very well orchestrated. I have no time to speak about that, but the flute stays in the high register, so you have the second resonance staying. Same thing by Kurtak Stel, where he orchestrates also the room in different speed of resonance. Something that I did in my last organ piece. I have a church, so it's already very resonating, but I orchestrate here a sort of Doppler effect, with quartetons. And suddenly you have the feeling that the church is much bigger, and also, of course, with a ratio from directional to unidirectional instruments. We listen to that. Be careful, it's very still here, and here it's loud. Okay, so this is also changing the space with the microtonal. It's an organ with a few microtonal registers. Background noise, we know that. And I finish with the emotive signs and the one of special effect. For example, a notable example is in the Valse by Ravel. Ravel has a lot of that. There are not so many composers who have examples like that. But it starts with things, and he has a sort of interjection, sort of breath in the harp you will listen to, and this is starting before something starts. Here, even more interesting. First, that is in the chapter interrelationship between different layers. You have one layer which is the waltz and the accompaniment, 1, 2, 3, and the waltz is here. He starts everything in the background, everything mysterious. You see, he does the same thing. He does with the bassoon appearing as if they were very far and very mysterious. And same thing for the accompaniment 1, 2, 3. It's contrabass beats, and the third beat is with the harp very, very low and timpani, and you have a noise to hide everything. So that is another chapter. It's about the interaction between layers. But you have the beginning of the waltz, ta 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 ta, and you have a sort of a side like that. And it's completely orchestrated. It comes from Debussy, La Mer, this sort of thing, but it's completely orchestrated, and you just hear a sort of small emotion after the beginning of the waltz. You understand like that. And then you have the tutti-like writing, chamber music writing. There are other functions, but here I try to present the most important thing to make it thinking. I'm very happy to have presented that. My point is that it evolved a lot the last year, thanks to people from Actor, to Bob, to Steve, to Kit, to Victor, to all those people. And now I am a little blocked. So I hope people to continue those research. I'm just composer. I'm not a theoretician and a professor of orchestration. And also perhaps if you have some ideas of how to continue, it's thanks to Kit, we had the discussion with the coupling, or thanks to other people with the texture, that I could continue to this research. So, this is why I wanted to present you that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Fabien. We have some time for questions. We have another hour or so available here. I think I would ask maybe if people can use the Zoom hand raise function. That way we'll really see who's in the queue for questions. That might be the easiest way to organize it. If you can't find that or anything, send me a text or just give a big wave, and I'm sure we'll see you there as well. Maybe I can start things off. One thing I've been fascinated by in this project throughout is the immense work of classification, finding approaches to all these different effects. And something I found was particularly interesting was the idea of strategies. This was back when we talked about texture, for example, and really talking about merging strategies to bring things together. I guess it's fairly fundamental for all of your thinking to separate aims from techniques. I'm kind of curious how you think of strategies and all that. Is that a technique? Is it an aim? Is it somewhere in between?
Yeah, I see the question because you are a musicologist as well. Of course, let's answer. It's related, strategies and functions, but the strategies are perhaps before. This is what we do every day as a composer. They are not automatically verbalized. And when you verbalize it, when you want to transmit it, it becomes a function. It will be like that I will differentiate that. For example, the strategies of merging, we have all strategies to do that, but it's still not clear. And the functions, this is this very clear categories between effect and techniques. Until now, this is where I make the differentiation. I hope you will help me. I am sure Victor will help me. Is the one who helped me also to put a relationship between function and aims. But I will answer this way.
So questions are certainly welcome. One thing that oh, Andres, please.
Yeah, hi, Fabien. Thank you so much for this presentation. I like this is a continuation from the Y6 one, so yeah, very thankful for that. I noticed that because of this kind of work is score based, looking at comparing them with different types of performances, which ones are, how much is then, might there be a difference between performances, or how that which you see in the score is then realized by certain recordings, or how that the relationship between what's on the score and then what happens on a recording, if you've also looked into that, or if that is also an issue where there's big discrepancies.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very good question. Once again, I am a composer. I have no time to look at that. We need, of course, to see if those functions are stable first, are really consequent. I'm not a researcher. I compose, I teach composition. And we need people to see what you say, if it changes or not. It changes, of course, when you have the directionality of the instruments is different when you have Baroque orchestra and modern orchestra, for example. Yeah, also, you have many philharmonic room now where you can sit behind, like the Berlin Philharmonic room, a hall where you can sit. But here you see it's very efficient. For me, my goal was, of course, to help my students and myself to be very clear when you compose, it works. Principally, it works. After that, there are a lot of subtlety, a lot of change. Of course, the trumpet is not always directional. If you put a mute, you can, etc., and you can hide the effect. But it gives you some big categorization in a field which was very almost not verbalized until now. And I think it's a huge field of research which has to continue. first to see if all the repertoires worked that way. Secondly, the performance. It means we need a research program with PhD, with musicologists, with theoreticians, psychoacousticians working on that way. It's really the beginning. We're in the prehistory. But a very good question.
Oh, Stephen.
Yes, thanks, Fabien. I think every time I hear you talk about this, I understand a bit more, which is good. And but I'm wondering, it seems to me there's a kind of very fuzzy relationship between functions and actually perceived effects, which sort of picks up on what Andres was talking about, because he's talking about what happens when you actually have a realization in a performance, and that, of course, then becomes the thing that people are hearing. And so I was thinking, looking at the one example you were talking about, various kinds of couplings where one instrument dominates and so on, which in perceptual terms, we would call a timbral augmentation. So there's a blend, there's a fusion of the things, but you can still identify or recognize one instrument. And then the other one, which we call timbral emergence, you talked about as well, the Dalbavie example there, where then everything sort of fuses together, but now it becomes no longer possible to individually identify the constituent elements. And so that sounds very much like a perceptual effect. And so I'm wondering, how do you, I mean, all these things between functions or aims and then techniques for realizing something that then turns into an effect, what's that kind of fuzzy relation? How do you see this distinction between, let's say, functions and effects?
You remember that when we started Actor, actually it was you and Denis Julian who asked me to use other terms, because we had these three things. And you remember, for analyzing, we needed to have something in between the techniques and the effect. You are completely right that the functions at the end, for most of them, because you have the difficulty of the strategies, but there are universal effects, either acoustical or psychoacoustical or cognitive, let's say. But this is made for composers or for instruments. So it's very important to have a very clear first categorization of all, but that in three parts, etc. Then inside them, and to be efficient, operative for musicians. The example of crescendo, for example. So it's mostly it's made with musical words or words which speak to music. But you are right that at the end, we try to translate universal effects, which are either psychoacoustical or acoustical or psychological in its cognitive, and we try to put that in terms of function. It's a little bit similar to in harmony, you had the degrees, and when you put dominant, subdominant, behind that you have an effect, a psychological effect of tension, etc. This is that a function, but you are right that it's very similar to the effects that you are doing, and to thanks to you that we could do all those research. I hope I could answer.
Great. Roger?
Yeah. Okay. I hesitate to go now, except that I saw that there were not other hands, because I have a fairly, let's say, multi-part response. So I would just say I'm glad to continue with that right now, but if there are more particular questions regarding his presentation, I'm glad to step aside for a moment and return when people are more exhausted.
Why don't we go ahead now, Roger, and we'll continue with questions. We
All right,
aren't
so
lacking time.
I'll do my best. I'll start out by saying that I think it's an extraordinary space that you've created for the consideration of issues that a composer faces when she tries to manifest imaginative opportunities, aims, processes, some of which you may specifically already envision, or whatever the say whatever the parallel and heron that you already hear, or things that you're trying because you don't know what they sound like and you're curious about that space. So I feel in general that what you've done is really extraordinary. And one of my sort of key tests for things is, are they plausible? Not are they correct or are they complete or the way I think about it, things. But I thought really everything you said was plausible. And for me, that's very high praise. So the issue that comes to my mind right away is the degree to which we are conscious of what we are trying to do or are doing, or that we're unconscious. And I give you a quick anecdote. The last year of his life, Morton Feldman was at UCSD, and he gave a composition seminar to a small group, maybe around 8 composers, all of whom were passionately interested in what he had to say. And I would say that by the end of the quarter, most of the people, maybe all but one in that seminar, had stopped composing. And the question was, I don't mean forever, but they had ceased to be able to go ahead. And so the question was, why? And in my speaking informally with several of them, it was that Feldman was constantly trying to get under their intuitive reasons for choice and to critique it, but not critique it according to, let's say, an understandable set of principles. He would just simply say, why is that an F sharp? Why is it in that register? Why does it have that dynamic, et cetera, et cetera? It turns out that this basically disenabled the capacities of these young and probably not completely formed composers to move. There were just simply too much fear, right? Why? So as you're probably aware, Steve and I and Emmanuel Bigond and others did a project called The Angel of Death some years back. And the thing that I got from that was that my assumptions about what listeners heard were inaccurate. I expected too much, and I expected the identification of too many independent elements, and I expected too much in terms of the way those component elements were transformed over the piece. So that brings me to what utility to a composer the space of consideration that you've established, I think admirably, how that can be used. So the first point, I guess, is that this resource, which is to say ways of thinking about, looking at, conceiving or understanding musical objects, musical processes, is now there. The question is, the next question is, how will it be navigated? And the flood of potential that you released on us, subsumed us for an hour. This is, it's daunting, right? It's daunting. So the question partly would be, how do you align? How might it be possible to align the particular interest of a particular composer to find his or her way into the labyrinth, right? So that the things that are relevant immediately become, are not drowned in a sea of other potential considerations. So the last thing is, I feel that this, you mentioned when you were very early in your presentation about space, you mentioned that the space could have a focus, right? The third option was that there be, within the direction of the space, that there be also a kind of angular intensity that would concentrate on a particular circumstance. And so this idea of the existence of a resource, the curation and documentation of access to that resource, and then the ability to pare it down, right? I mean, if we look at Schoenberg's Opus 16, number 3, this is the or Webern's, Richard Carr instrumentation. These are extraordinary examples of what our attentive facilities can manage if there's not too much competition. So that issue for me, the amount, the number, and the intensity with which we are considering consciously what we're doing, elements that we're working with as makers of music, or back to Bob Hasegawa, examiners of music which has been made. I think that this issue of focus is absolutely mandatory. And if we don't do that, and I say this about the whole of actor also, if we don't do this, then we lose, what's the right word? We lose the capacity to manifest in significant ways the richness of the space we're in. Sorry for the ramble, but
thank you very much for your words. I won't answer to everything because there are a lot of ideas, and I think I am teaching composition for very long, and here I see one student, at least a former student, Pablo, who studied with me, now is back in his country. Of course, here I spoke about orchestration. When I teach composition, it's not at all normative, not at all on contrary. I try the people to make their own path. I hope, Pablo, you will confirm. You can say a few words if you want after that. I have a motto in my class. I want to avoid two things, which is dilettantism and academism. Dilettantism means we need to know all those techniques in electroacoustic, in orchestration, etc. But of course, to have this sort of abstraction so that we don't compose like other, and this way of doing functional orchestration, suddenly you discover how modern Schubert was compared to Haydn, how modern, etc. So we are still in music, and it's very important that my students would understand like that, how modern it was with the same function, with the same category of texture. You have Wertführer, you have Ravel, etc. And the other one is not to be academic, it means not to repeat that. So this is those two things, but that is another chapter. It's where I teach composition. I have a lot of strategies too. They are not functions, but they are strategies so that people develop in their way. That. And about the focus, of course, you're right. It's not only the space focus, but all the psychological, the cognitive focus, which is important in music, something different. But here we see, this is also the question by Steve. This project wouldn't have existed without Steve, without actor. It's really related to the effect. It's just a technique of teaching composition, teaching orchestration, and speaking about the music. But of course, we speak all the time about the effects, psychoacoustical effects, acoustical effect, but also cognitive effect, psychological effect. It's a big part of the composition, for example, the focus. Pablo, you want to say something, or and after?
Let me just add one thing. So the simple way of saying what I was saying is that inundation can create the lack of how do I want to say this? Inundation and mobilization. That if one is inundated, one becomes immobilized, or that's a possibility. And that's the thing which I think is so important when faced with the kind of richness of the space you proposed.
Perhaps I can say, I found really, really interesting this anecdote of Feldman teaching by just asking why, because it's really similar to what Fabien does in his lessons. I think you can agree. He helps a lot to verbalize what one is trying to intuitively do. And on the question of how does this research apply now with younger composers or with newer generations in the future, I think this is the problem of theorizing. It's always done on things that already exist. So I guess it's now on us to try to apply it. I will not talk about my music, but his research and his teachings and everything that he spoke about today really helped me conceptualize the way I compose.
Again, quickly, not to be misunderstood, what Feldman was doing was not in the presence of any structure such as Fabien has proposed. So the lack of a framework against which his critique could be responded to or measured, that was the issue.
Yeah. Hans?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Fabien. It was really a very nice survol. I have probably in response to Stephen's question also, it's the all-time struggle between those who try to create within a mental framework of references and those who analyze what came out of it. So we have this kind of spectrum of the creator and the analyzer. And I think what you propose here is really what I would like to add to it is this aim of the idealism. So when we think about orchestrating something, obviously we think about the audience sitting in the middle of the hall and hearing it with the disposition of the instruments we have thought of. If you already change that and you sit in the first row next to the double basses, well, that changes the masking. So we can't take every single aspect of the realization and particularly one performance of it into account when we think about writing. We have to write for an idealized setting. And I think in that regard, and also in your regard of teaching, this is really a very helpful tool because it helps us to think in this kind of, okay, I want to create something which works in my mind and hopefully works in the hall. What I would like to see, if you encourage people to do a PhDs on that, to do much more analyses on the current repertoire. So actually is even going into the 21st century, because that's probably something where we don't have much material, particularly in teaching. I mean, we know all the Beethoven and Haydn and Ravel examples, or we can easily recreate them. But there's a real lack, probably because things are not so easy to categorize anymore. And because the catalog of exceptions is probably bigger than the catalog of following some rules. One last example, I found I forget the term, the emoji thing, whatever that is, less convincing because you could just think about contrast analysis. So not every of these examples really spoke to me as what I understood to be what you meant, but probably I misunderstood. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. Very quickly, because we are in the same debate. First, here I spoke about orchestration. When I teach composition, it's completely different. It's nothing to do with composition, let's say. When I teach composition, it goes much more about non-verbalized. I ask why, but I don't want the person to answer, and I don't want to norm. I say always the room of composition is an irrational room. People can sing, etc. It's just the question of becoming yourself and trying things which are not known, of course, trying to be in the, like Derrida says, to be beyond the verbalized, to try things which don't exist or which are not. I have many examples. For example, I made an analysis of glissandi by Ligeti, and what is a glissando, and you can be in between a glissando. So I like to destroy the categories, let's say, in composition, much more than in orchestration. In orchestration, here what we do is a little bit more normalized. It's about having abstract concept. It's very useful. Even when I do Schubert, when I speak about mixture instead of doubling for the beginning, suddenly the conductor, the composer understand what it is. And when you compose, you have things which you have to try, new horizons, but you have things which work. It means yesterday I was in the Naschingen a few days ago, and you have people, if you don't know what is a directional instrument and directional, this is like that. You have some instruments which are directional. You can't do with an oboe what you do with a clarinet. You have to know that. And even Beat Faurer is very careful about his oboe, which plays only multiphonic. So you have some universal things, cognitive or acoustic, and you have some things where the creativity has to push beyond the normalization. And here, this is what Pablo said, or what you said, or what Roger said. You have a French historian of art, who says the art is the future of the theory. The theory comes always after the art. The sonata form was verbalized much later and wrong after Mozart and mostly. So we have to try. We have to try. So it's this sort of travel between verbalization, clarity, distanciation, would say Derrida, but also trying, being crazy, and opening a new horizon. And that for me is very important. It's why I differentiate the orchestration class from the composition class, for instance. And about just the emoji, yeah, it's not clear, but it helped me to say, okay, there is something else. I idealize Ravel in a way, but it's not only contrast. It puts aside, it puts something in the music which is incredible. When he hits a point, everybody will orchestrate like boom. No, he adds the movement of the hands. This is what I said, but I completely agree with you that the third part is completely unclear now, and it will certainly stay unclear many years.
Matthias?
Hi, Fabien. Thank you very much for your presentation. I love it too much. So I have a question because I read a lot of your work, and in a book you said that consonance is very cultural, and the perception of what is consonant is about our culture. So when I compose now, I have many questions: what is real, universal, or what is not? But I think that we can have the answer like a composer. But by the other way, you just say that there is like a universal effect in music. Can you maybe speak a bit more, give more details about that, please?
So it's a huge question, but you are in the center of the topics. This is what Steve makes for a lot of years. About consonants, I really advise you to read my book. It's unfortunately in French, but yeah, I deconstruct all the normative theories of the consonants in my book, from Helmholtz to tonal consonants to etc. And at the end to terarts to etc. And I had a discussion with Steve. It was a long time ago when Steve was still at IRCAM about cognitive consonants. Can it be universal? Even I was using epistemology, the duem paradoxa. When we test people, can we make it universal or just that is duem, beginning of the 20th century? Or Popper also speaks of that. Do you just prove that some people or many people listen to that, but you have other type of dissonance? Like so, in my and at the end, I come from the conclusion that consonants, my definition is it sounds to me, and you have to construct your own consonants. This is the role of the new music. Tristan Cord was dissonant and became consonant. It's a long discussion. Read this book, which is very complex. But you are right that we are here also between principles of universality, of normativity, and principle of building new words. As you perhaps know, I am a fan of paradoxon in music, and the definition of a paradox in the Greek philosophy, this is something which seems not true, but which will become true later, like the Ricet paradox, that you don't have a sound which is high and low. Everybody thinks a sound can be high and low, but actually no. And Ricet or Shepard, etc., showed there's nothing. So, and we are there as an artist. I did that. I was even obliged to do that. I would have preferred to compose, but of course, it's a very, very, very small part of my work. I work mostly about deconstruction, about paradox, about misleading, and building new words, which is what we are for as an artist. I hope I answered very quickly. Thank you.
I'd like to maybe come in, Fabien, with a kind of comment and then a more specific question. I was thinking in the course of our discussions about your book chapter, which covers a lot of these ideas, and I should say is coming out in the Oxford Handbook of Orchestration Studies next year, that we talked a little bit about this question of whether a function is an effect or an aim. And I think ultimately it is a desired effect in some way. If I understand right, the reason you're not simply calling it an effect is that it comes earlier in the creative process somehow. It's the composer's sought for effect or idea of an effect or ideal of an effect, whereas the perceived effect might not be perceived until much later when the piece is actually heard and by an audience. Um, I was thinking about also how much the number of concepts, as Roger mentioned, is kind of a fascinating point to me. And I know in your chapter, you phrase this very much as kind of problem solving. I'd be curious if this is how you teach this as well. If you want to create a texture, but it's not working, for example, maybe you need more emerging techniques. If you want to have two separate lines, but they aren't emerging, maybe you need one of these spatial doublings, something like that. So that to me made me think maybe it's not paralyzing, but kind of a heuristic or like a troubleshooting. This isn't working. How do I fix it? And finally, if I can have a specific question, I thought a lot about the space examples that you gave, and I could think of lots of examples where you'd want to have a directional instrument, let's say to make a line come out, or to separate lines, or to clarify a texture. And I was curious, when do you need to add, let's say to solve a problem again, when do you need to add non-directional instruments? Like what is that doing in your textures?
Thank you. Great questions and great. Thank you for this definition of functions like desired effect, because there is something in it. You're right. I didn't think about that, but the effects. This is scientists who describe those effects. They exist, and with functions, I am an artist, so the idea is really to open this word effect so that we could create things which don't exist with this aim. So it's something abstract which exists, but in a very high frame. And I agree with all these discussions that between effect and strategies, we have the functions in between. It's strategies are unrational, unscientific. Functions are more categorized. It's a taxonomy, let's say, or it's something to think logically. And effects are really proven by Steve and all their teams and many people. And I try to be a little bit above. So thank you for this definition of desired effect. It could work. And once again, I insist, it's acoustically, psychoacoustically, but also psychologically. And so it's why we come to the second question about the strategy. Yeah, this is what we do all the time when I teach composition. The most important thing, of course, is to help the students not to stay where they are. I have a technique called step 1, step 2, step 3 that my students know. Is to put things in question with the same constraints, trying, oh, I have this code, I have this project. Can I try the same thing in a different way? It's a strategy of pushing yourself, let's say. It's completely unscientific. It's not about sitting and making a list. It's about being crazy and trying with the same thing. At the end, you make a piece which is not music, which is people are laughing. But that is really the main method when I teach composition. It means it's not an analytical method, but it's pushing the student to understand what they do, but to find the solution which is really incredible. But true, then in the realization, sometimes the contrary. You are right that when someone wants something which merges, we try strategies of merging or strategy of laying with that paradoxon that if you know my music, from the beginning when I started to compose, I try to find this paradoxon where I wanted from the beginning that people don't know if it's a mosaic or if it's a texture, if it's multi-layers. It means as an artist, we have clear categories and we have to try another voice, which is crazy, which doesn't exist. I was speaking about Glissandi by Ligeti. I can say the anecdote because I loved. I took all my students in composition. I asked them, what is a glissando, and make a piece. And they were drawing, and they were going in every direction. Some were more academic, making lists. Some were more crazy, but it was things. Until we said, at least for glissando, we have one definition that is universal. It starts somewhere and it stops somewhere. But I had one student in the class, and I was so happy, who said no. And he started to sing. I hope per Zoom it will work. He said, with hesitating. And I said, you're right. So you break the scientific definition of yes and no. And this is what I like from the composers. They are above, Derrida would say, above the frontier of the construction. So that is the game between formalizing, not formalizing, breaking the formalization, creating paradoxes that we speak about that. And same thing for non-directional. Of course, if you use only directional instruments, it's boring. First, you have to create virtual instruments. You have to play with the focus, with opening the thing. If you do a texture, you need a lot of unidirectional instruments, like Ligeti, Daphnis, Beat Furrer. They are all unidirectional. Compared always with mute. They are in 7th parallel motion, so that it merges a lot. So, but directional are, so it's just tools which are very useful to know what you want to do. And first of all, I have students from, I noticed that some students from China, for example, they have a complete different way of considering directionality and non-directionality, because in the traditional Chinese music, for those who know that, instruments are, or in Korea, something, you know, these small trumpets that they have in both countries. Instruments can be very directional, and however, creating very interesting texture. So they have a different approach of what is merging sometimes, but very interesting for me, what could be merging, even if you have elements which are striking. And that also is art and could be very interesting. I hope I answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Any other questions from the Zoom audience? Okay, well, in that case, I think we can thank Fabien again. Oh, sorry, Yoshiaki, please.
Thank you so much. First of all, for Fabien, for inviting people like me to join you, and I'm also one of the former students of Fabien, and at Columbia University, and I benefited tremendously from his teaching. And I actually have a question now as I teach at the university in the United States, University of Delaware to be exact. And I've done one running of the orchestration course a year ago, and I'm going to be doing this course again in next semester. And so my question is a little bit related to that. I know that your concept and your work in orchestration, Fabien, is evolving, and I could see that from the presentation that you had to go through really quickly and everything like that. But my question is, how long? I mean, how long does it take? Do you teach all of these in one course? But also another, I guess, the follow-up question, because the format of the course or teaching is different in Europe or any other countries. I mean, do you conceive these concepts to be taught in the span of, let's say, one academic semester, or do you see this as like it would occupy like one full year of teaching? Because I think that all these concepts that you elucidate is really, really potent, and I think it really needs careful considerations. And I know from giving the concept of also supplying all these different examples and commenting all that to the students, it can take either an hour would go by really quickly. And so it's really sometimes challenged to cover all these concepts. Not to mention, of course, very often orchestration in the United States is taught almost in tandem with the element of instrumentation, which is kind of a study that should proceed before covering orchestration, but the sad reality of it is that they tend to fuse these two things together. Very unfortunately, it is the case here, and I'm hoping to try to change that. But I'm just really curious, how long it takes for you to teach all that. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoshi, and I'm very happy to see you, that you are here. I have also Sang, who is here, so former students who do that. And I must say, for the anecdote, Yoshi makes me feel now a grandfather, because I have now sometimes students of Yoshi coming to summer courses, and they repeat some concept like step 1, step 2, step 3, or direction, etc. that I taught. And so it means Yoshi continues that, and I know that also you use the orchestration theories. I will surprise you. I never teach orchestration with those theories, those concepts like that. Never. First, I am in a conservatory, but at Columbia, I even didn't do that. I start with pieces. I start with works. I started again this year. It's every second year I do that. I do that chronologically. Then we go to new music. And now more and more, but even when Pablo was there, it was not that. Sometimes I put in bracket and I say, okay, so we have 6 doublings, 6 step, and I explain. Or perhaps I will speak about the texture. Perhaps I will speak about the true logic, yeah, from the beginning, because it's a tool. It's really useful when they orchestrate. But I believe to the praxis. And so analyzing a lot of pieces, I asked my student, I think it was also the advice that I gave you, reading, being on the beach, reading Sacre du Printemps all the time, understanding intuitively those concepts. And now sometimes I put some concept. And the other thing is also, you remember, but more in Europe I do that, I do the seminar and I do the praxis, and the praxis they have to write. And what you observe is that they think, the virtual object by Brahms are clear. We do 3 weeks on Brahms. When they try to write, they can't. So you have the understanding, but you have also the praxis, which is much more difficult. I know from me, I needed many years to be able. So now about all those concepts, or the possible book, or the possible article, first, I don't know if I will publish when there's the book. Many people say you need to make those concepts public, and that's why I spoke today. On the other hand, I think I am a composer and I need one life, or perhaps many people who have to continue that. So I'm not sure to publish, but it will be more a book for teachers of composition than for the students. If you put all those concepts for the students, they won't become a good orchestrator. This is my feeling. So praxis is the most important. And when you conceptualize, I do the same when I teach composition. You know me, I have read Derrida, I have read psychology. I never speak in the class of Derrida in distanciation, grammatology, etc. But it's tools for us as a teacher to have those concepts and then to make them progress. When you have 1 year, of course, it's first praxis, reading a lot of scores and slowly understanding that. And you need to know those. I know that you were very supportive also with my writing that you used. I hope I answer.
Okay, any other hands? Wonderful. Well, in that case, thank you again, Fabien. It's wonderful to have you here for this talk. A lot of food for thought, I think, and many threads, as you say, that could become future research, future dissertations, future articles.